So, Jada Bisteli is a researcher specializing in ethics applied to conversational AI. Her research mainly focuses on ethical frameworks, value theory, as well as applied and descriptive ethics. She is currently a principal ethicist in Hugging Face, where she conducts interdisciplinary research on AI, ethics, and content moderation. Jada brings invaluable perspective to the machine learning and artificial intelligence community. She works with stakeholders, such as policymakers, managers, and AI specialists, raising awareness of the potential risks and issues related to machine learning, AI, and most recently, generative models. So if you are ready, we can maybe switch the, yeah. I can, just a second. I'm going to quickly make the setup, and you can then take over. So, floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Wow. Hello, everyone. Ooh, sorry, I'm melting. I just climbed a lot of stairs to come here. I just got here, but it's great to be here with you. And thank you so much for inviting me. Can you see my screen? OK, amazing. So thanks for the introduction. So today, we're going to talk about how to integrate ethics in machine learning. Of course, it's just going to be like a kind of an overview of everything that we could do. So just to kind of announce what we're going to talk about, I'm going to make like a brief introduction to ethics, since we talk a lot about ethics, but what does it mean? And then, of course, we're going to do like a big focus on machine learning, and then I'm going to show you like a concrete example, especially coming from my work and my research. And then, of course, we're going to have some time for Q&A, of course. So, what is ethics? It didn't get invented with machine learning, of course, even though we talk about it a lot lately. It's a branch of philosophy, and it deals with human action. So, its etymology, so it can come both from ancient Greek and Latin. So, I know this can be kind of controversial, but I don't really make a difference and a distinction between, this is coming off, a distinction between moral philosophy and ethics, so we have the Greek ancient Greek etymology, ethos, and then you have a Latin etymology, which is moralis, and they both mean the same thing. So what do they mean? They mean manners, conduct, way of life, habit. So as I was saying, it deals with human action. So even when we try to apply, of course, ethics to some like life context, it can be your business, it can be so conduct or whatever it can be, it still means the same thing, and we're still dealing with humans. Of course, I can't cover everything, but some of the big topics that ethics deal with, it's the distinction between what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, Happiness, the meaning of life, values, like value theory, axiology, freedom, free will, etc., etc. So the big questions would be what we ought to do, what are the values, oops, there's a typo, sorry. What are the values and norms guiding my actions? What should I do? What's best for me? How can I get like a better life? How can I be more just to others, etc., etc. So this is kind of just a quick grasp of what's ethics in general. So we have what we call moral theories. It means that, of course, because we want to define what's good and bad, what we ought to do, how to treat others, how we can be just, you can imagine that not all philosophers agree on what's the best way to achieve that. So we have what we call different moral theories. And here I insist, I put it into brackets, but I insist that like the most known ones, and I'm sure lots among you, maybe many of you already know them. Those are pretty much Western moral theories. This is what it's taught, especially like in in Europe, in the US. But there are different moral theories that are really also interesting and existing in other parts of the world. Like, for instance, you have Ubuntu ethics, Confucian ethics. I remember talking about briefly Confucian ethics yesterday night. But we're just going to focus on the main, like I would say mainstream maybe. So we have consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. This is super nice, sorry, it keeps falling. So consequentialism means that the moral value of an action, so of a human act, is contained in its consequences, so no surprises. Maybe you're familiar with the very known utilitarianism. So utility, it's kind of a false friend because it doesn't mean what's useful to something, but it's just a mathematical addiction of what could be like, how can I get the best, like how can I reach the happiness or the best for the larger number of people. So this is really, I would say, it's a really known moral theory. It's applied on a lot of different parts of life, especially economics deals a lot with consequentialism, but we can still talk about it later in the Q&A if it's needed. And so what do we mean by we morally evaluate an action's consequences? That, of course, what it's going to be considered good or bad are the consequences of just an action. Like if I'm going to throw like a stone to someone and it's going to hit maybe one person instead of 5 people, then it's best. Maybe you're familiar with the famous trolley dilemma in the 60s by Philippa Foot. She made this thought experiment to kind of make fun of utilitarianism and to kind of see its limits. Then we have deontology. So the main philosopher, with no surprise, is Kant. So he used to live here in Switzerland, actually. And an action is considered good if it is intrinsically right and it is kind of easy to make it universalize. I don't know how to pronounce that word. So what it means is that, for instance, when we're trying to say, like, do not steal, not stealing, it's always going to be considered as bad, according to deontology. Deontos, from ancient Greek, means code. So maybe you're familiar, for instance, this applies a lot for instance, to like business ethics or professional ethics. Maybe you're familiar with doctors' deontology, like the Hippocratic Oath or something like that. Okay, I don't know what's happening. And so we morally evaluate the agent's intentions. It means that what it's going to be considered, once again, good or bad, it really depends on the intrinsic values, if you want, of the agent's intentions. And so, is this person going to do good because he means good or not? Basically, like in a nutshell. Then virtue ethics comes, or I didn't say it, but consequentialism, it was actually really popular in the 18th century in the UK. And one of the most important philosophers was Jeremy Bentham. And then he had lots of students like John Stuart Mill and other philosophers. So virtue ethics, an action is considered good if it's performed by a virtuous agent. So this is kind of the, I would say, most ancient, at least in the West, moral theory, because it comes from Aristotle. And an action is considered good if it is performed by a virtuous agent. It means that ethics is seen as a habit, and so according to Aristotle, we're not born like good or bad, but we can become virtuous, and it's something that we can practice every day. So it's accessible to everyone, and if I'm going to do good like every day, at some point I'm going to become virtuous. So this is pretty good news. And so we're going to morally evaluate the agent. So to explain it really easily, I would say that, for instance, if you believe that, I don't know, Jesus or Greta Thunberg are virtuous people, then if you want to become virtuous, it means that you're going to act as they do. And yeah, really in a nutshell. Okay, fast forward. Now we saw what's ethics, what are kind of the main moral theories. And now we can talk about how do we apply ethics, for instance, or what are the domains of ethics. So we have three main domains. Maybe you heard of them: normative ethics, meta-ethics, and applied ethics. So normative ethics, it provides norms that prescribe what is right or good. So it means that, for instance, what we just saw in the last slide, those are considered as being normative ethics. So it means that it's going to tell us what is considered right or good, or bad, of course. Meta-ethics, it analyzes moral discourse, and it focuses on the nature of moral judgments. So I'm not going to go into details right there, because it's kind of the most, I would say, tricky domain of ethics. But in a nutshell, it's going to say, what do we mean by good? What do we mean by bad? What do we mean by right? What do we mean by wrong? So meta in Greek, it means going beyond. So it's trying to going beyond ethics. And then applied ethics, it's going to do today, really quickly. And it applies normative ethics norms to particular areas of life. So basically, it can, it takes what's prescribed by normative ethics, and it tries to apply it to a particular areas of life. So, for instance, we talk about medical ethics, like bioethics, but it can be also like business ethics, professional ethics, I don't know, war ethics, that's a thing, tax ethics, that's a thing. You can imagine all different domains of life, and then we can apply ethics there. So, I'm not going to explain machine learning to that audience, but we're going to ask us the question, okay, now that we kind of got what's ethics and how, like, somehow it works, what is you have to deal and what to do with machine learning. So I just prepared like a couple of slides, and you'll tell me afterwards if I'm missing something. But we're going to try to see, of course, by concepts, how machine learning works, and we're going to just divide it into two different phases, two different stages. So we're going to have the development stage, and the deployment stage. So in the development stage, we're going to have problem identification, data collection, data processing, feature engineering, model selection and training, model evaluation. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but you're quickly going to understand why I'm naming them. So if we, once again, just by concepts, divide what's basically called the machine learning pipeline into two different phases, we can start thinking of when, how, and why we do apply ethics. So let's take, for instance, data collection. Gather relevant data sources to train. So I'm not going to ask you questions now, but you can already try to imagine why, for instance, we should have, like, let's say, one of the moral theories that we just saw before, and why it's important, for instance, to try to apply ethics there. We're going to talk about it in a minute. Data processing, clear, preprocess, and transform the data, so you can already start figuring out why it's interesting, for instance, to be asking questions. So if we start asking questions like, what could be like a just way to do data processing? Like, of course, we're going to encounter problems as such as, I don't know, like privacy, or how the data is being collected, how it's going to be processed, et cetera, et cetera. Then we're going to see, so stick with me on these kind of ML pipeline concepts. Once again, we're going to divide into development and deployment. And so, for instance, if we try to summarize the deployment stage, we have integration, so how to embed the model into existing systems, blah, 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 UX, UI, ensure that it's user-friendly, accessible, answers users' needs, monitoring, maintenance, scalability, optimization, security, and compliance. Well, of course, the last one is going to be broader, and actually we're going to do a small focus on the ethical, legal, and technical compliance afterwards together. And so once again, if you try to ask the initial questions, like initial ethical questions, like how can we be just, how we can be treating, like, in a good way humans, because once again, even when we apply ethics to ML, never forget we're still talking about humans. So it's never basically about the machines, but it's always about the humans that are behind, the humans that are going to be affected, both positively and negatively. So let's try to ask ourselves then the question, where do we apply ethics and why? So this is kind of a summary and of what we just saw, and we can, I hope, already start thinking on how we should do that. So let's go into it. If we start by the question, where? So where do we apply ethics to the ML pipeline? Once again, I already gave you just like a small example. Let's just stick to the development stage. For instance, if we talk about the data set, of course it's not new, especially if some of you already know some of the big questions of what it's broadly called like ethics applied to AI. We got problems to deal with such as bias, overrepresentation, underrepresentation, forgot to close the bracket. And we also have, this is kind of, I would say, like the most known one. There's like a lot of literature about bias, and I'm sure you know. But biases are human, and what I always say that products or, I hope I'm not going to make enemies right now, but if people promise you to de-bias something, then you should be asking, what do we mean by the bias? And if we de-bias, then what's going to be like the point of view that we're going still to represent? Because it's still going to represent like a person's, individual's, or a small population's point of view. And so that's the same case about overrepresentation and underrepresentation, because of course, and I hope now you kind of start understanding why. It's important to also stress the fact that ethics, it doesn't mean consensus. It doesn't mean that there's just one way, a good way of doing things. But for instance, if one possible and really simple and engineering solution would be, well, let's just put everything in there. Let's just diversify our data set. Let's just bring it all in. Then it's not really going to answer our question. It's not really going to like the problem go away, because if we don't know and if we didn't decide yet what kind of normative ethics we're going to apply, or what kind of values you're going to put on top of the hierarchy, for instance, then it's just going to be like a really big melting pot, and it's not really going to solve the problem. Still in the development stage, of course, like I used the example of carbon footprint when we talk about hardware or computing, but we could also talk about accessibility, for instance. Like, let's say you're developing like a really big model. Then you wanted to make it reproducible, but how is it going to make it, like how are you going to make that happen if not all the people of the world have access to the same hardware that you do? That can become like an ethical, like a big ethical question. And of course, carbon footprint. So same way, like I'm going to do ML to solve climate change, but how you, like, are you going to use a lot of compute to do that? Then what's the gain? What's the bad side of it? So there's always a trade-off there too. And really briefly, if we focus on the deployment stage, then, and this is kind of one of my main focuses also in my research, we have, of course, use case applications. So we could have problems, ethical, like tensions about malicious uses, unintended uses, manipulation, disillusion. And when I talk about manipulation, disillusion, of course, I'm mostly talking about, like, let's say, text-to-image models or large language models, because I can make my models make, I don't know, vulnerable users believe that I want them to do something. Like, I don't know if you heard, I think that happened maybe 3-4 months ago, this Belgian man who committed suicide because he was talking to a chatbot, and he was really anxious about climate change, and apparently the chatbot told him that if he was going to kill himself, then he would save the planet. So of course he was already doing therapy, and he was already like a really vulnerable user. But I really stress this point because usually, at least from my experience, and I hope it's not your case, but a lot of ML engineers are really detached from the use case applications of their tools, and that's no good, because even if you imagine that you're going to develop like the best tool, and it's never going to be like used in malicious ways, I'm here to tell you that humans are unpredictable, and just having like a risk approach, like a risk prevention approach, it's not going to save you, because especially if you deliver those tools, deliver those models as being like magic boxes. And for instance, I'm talking about, I don't know, ChatGPT, and we say, oh, you can do anything with it. Well, humans are going to do anything with that, and you can be surprised. So it's really important to not forget use case applications. And so that kind of ties with my second bullet point, tied with user research. And so once again, it's really important to do education. And when I talk about education, it's not just in school, saying, yeah, you can, I don't know, that's how you use things. Is this for me? Thanks, really need it. It's really, use user research to tell your users how they're going to, and how they're supposed to use your tool, because we tend to forget that out there's a lot of people that are not really familiar with even the internet in general. Like, I'm thinking about my dad, he's over 70, and every time he's on Facebook or on the internet, everything he sees, he thinks that it's true, just because it's on the internet. And so let's not forget about the super elder people and your users and the super young, because those are the most vulnerable. So when I talk about education, it's just not in schools or giving keynotes or going to conferences. It's also like use your tools to communicate and to share information with your users. And so that is as also linked to the use case applications, intended versus unintended uses. It's really important to make that clear since the beginning. So it can be trivial, like for instance, don't use a computer vision model when there's no light. I don't know, because it's not going to work. That's pretty basic, trivial. But it could also be like, don't use a large language model to give, I don't know, medical advice, et cetera, et cetera. And we could give other examples, but this is just in a nutshell. And then you could ask the question, yeah, but why do I need to apply ethics there? What's the point? What's the reason why? Well, I argue that both stages are equally important, of course, and there aren't like, for instance, the problem of biases in, I don't know, large language models or other, I don't know, ML artifact is not less or more important than the other points that we saw together. But both of them, they require contextual-based and depth in ethical analysis and assessment. So it means that it's not going, like, you're not going to solve the problem in a couple of slides, which is what most companies, especially in the industry, hope, especially when doing ethical assessments, but it's going to require a more in-depth analysis. And once again, I could never stress this point enough. Really focus on the humans involved. So we talked about representations in data. We can talk about interactions, so human-computer interaction, human-machine interaction, the uses, intended uses, unintended, and also about the impact that those technologies are going to have on human lives. So it could be both positive and negative, but it's still going to happen. And when we talk about humans, it's important to distinguish so individuals and then broader societies. So, and once again, when we talk about users, we're still talking about humans. So I know that might seem trivial and maybe stupid to stress that point, but that's what ethics is about. Okay. So time is running, so I'm going to go to the second part of our presentation. I told you that we were going to give you like a concrete example now that we saw kind of an overview into the interaction. I'm going to share with you one of the latest research that I did. Because, and why I focused on that is that if you remember in the deployment stage when we talk about ethical and legal assessment or compliance, what I saw in my experience is that we tend to mix everything up. Like I could talk with some developers and they would be like, yeah, but my tool is super ethical, it's GDPR compliant. That's legal compliant, that's not ethical compliance. So I thought that it was important to kind of like start over with the basics. And so I wrote with my co-authors this paper that shows what's interesting about these three kind of compliance, these three different notions of compliance, and how they interact together, and how they, of course, are also complementary. And once again, of course, every time in the ML landscape. So if we start with ethical compliance, it involves the detailed articulation of principles or values that are usually enshrined in ethical charters. So as you were hearing in the presentation, one of my main tools of applied ethics are ethical frameworks. So this is why I focus on that. So this articulation catalyzes direct moral responsibility on the part of the people who signed and draft a charter, for instance. So let's take those three different notions of compliance as our to-go example. Like let's say you're developing something and you're going to be compliant on the three levels. What are you going to do? Let's imagine you're going to write a charter. You're going to give yourself a framework. Okay, that's a good start, and once again, just a start, your job is not done. That's a good start for ethical compliance. Then let's move over to legal compliance. So it involves ensuring that AI systems comply with relevant laws and regulations. No surprise. This is when we say, oh, my tool is GDPR compliant. It's legally compliant, it's not ethically compliant. So it involves a social articulation between business, for instance, and authorities. And we could also talk about standardization, et cetera, et cetera. When we go to technical compliance, that involves ensuring that AI systems meet technical standards and specifications. So it ensures, for instance, that AI systems are reliable, safe, and explainable. So if we try to summarize that into 3 questions, let's see how, so this really cryptic branch of philosophy, which is ethics, law, and computer science, how they can interact together and how they're useful to make kind of an analysis framework. So ethical questions are going to answer questions such as how ought this technology be used? Do you remember the one of the very first slides? It's like how ought a life should be lived, or how ought should I be acting towards humans around me? You're in the realm of ethics. Legal, it's how shall this technology be used? So of course, it's more prescriptive. And technical, how can this technology be used? We talked about intended uses, unintended uses, do I need more light, do I need more data, blah, blah, blah. So, for instance, let's take our 3 different notions of compliance and all the tools that we talked about. So I talked about ethical charters, ethical frameworks, and my legal tool are going to be, for instance, ML licenses. And my technical tools are going to be model and data cards. I work with them, so I'm sorry, I had to pick them. So I divided this articulation in 3 different aspects that are normative, prescriptive, and descriptive. So of course, with no surprise, normative gives the norms, you remember, normative ethics. Prescriptive is going to tell you what you can do, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. And then descriptive, it's going to just describe the facts, like you need blah, blah, blah GPUs to make it run, you need more light, you need more data, what we said before. And so usually, like, the normative aspect of this articulation is going to express the values that are important for your project, for your ML artifact. Then the prescriptive is going, as I said, going to tell you what's allowed, what's prohibited. And the descriptive is going to just tell you what are the capabilities. And by drafting an extensive documentation, it's going to help you understand that. So in my kind of weird image, we can see that all the flashes, like the dot flashes that come from ethical charters, those are values. So the values are going to inform both technical documentation and ML licensing. How so? If we say that, as we said before, you want your ML artifact to be reproducible, how are you going to make that up? So let's say the reproducibility is a really known value, especially in the scientific process. It's no surprise. And so the value of reproducibility is going to go towards technical documentation, because if you want it to be reproducible, then it means that also people with normal hardware should be able to reproduce your ML artifact. And in ML licensing, it's going to be shared, for instance, with I don't know, an Apache license or other type of licenses. And then regulation, which is also prescriptive, it's going to be informed by values, and it's going to also inform the technical documentation. So we can go back to that if you want, but I just wanted to give you a practical example to make this articulation that I described here in theory more tangible. So, no surprise, I was involved in the BigScience workshop, and these three notions of compliance existed there, and that's why I take this example as a kind of a concrete example. For those of you who don't know, so the BigScience workshop, it was an open science project that developed a really large multilingual language model, which is called Bloom, and its dataset, multilingual dataset, called Roots, really into plants. It was a large-scale collaborative effort because we were over 1,000 researchers. And full disclosure, of course, when you're over 1,000 researchers, we're not all the 1,000 working on the same things, but we were distributed on different working groups that I'm going to show you later. And of course, there are also people that are just there to share information, share knowledge, learn. I personally learned a lot from that. And what was interesting is that there was so like a wide range of different disciplines interacting with each other. And this is one of my favorite parts, and I hope you got it also from my latest research. I think in the AI, ML, whatever you want to call it, realm and scientific process, like interdisciplinarity, it's going to be key. So this is how we were organized. We had like different working groups. There were like project working groups, data tokenization, modeling, evaluation, different domains on where we wanted to apply our knowledge. I was co-chair of the Ethical and Legal Scholarship, and I wrote the ethical charter for the project. But of course, there were also interpretability, engineering, carbon footprint, what else? Evaluation, multilinguality, prompt engineering, retrieval, metadata. You know better than I do. So how the three notions of compliance that we saw worked together in this specific context. So through a consensus-based process, the BigScience collaborators described and outlined the project intrinsic values. So when I talk about consensus here, is that if I can be geeky, I used and applied the discourse ethics from Habermas to pick and define all the values that were important to us. It means that we were around a round table, virtual round table, and we were like, what does accessibility mean to you? What does inclusivity mean to you? Why do you think it's important for this project? What do you think it's contextual to this project? How can we use accessibility or inclusivity, for instance, to make the project better and to work better for the humans behind them? So those values inform the development of the Rail Appendix use restrictions and Bloom's model card. Are you familiar with the Rail license? No. Okay, really briefly, it means responsible AI licensing. And one of the people that was involved in developing the Rail licenses, Carlos Muñoz Ferrandis, was also one of the co-authors of the paper. And it's an initiative that, of course, came before and existed before BigScience, also including other people and other researchers. But we really, I think, I don't want to be mistaken, but I think that BigScience was one of the, like Bloom was one of the first artifacts that used that kind of licensing, and now it's also available for your projects on the Hugging Face platform. So, what's peculiar about the Rail licensing is that it's a really permissive license for your ML tools, but at the same time, it has a really important appendix, which is, of course, use restrictions, and that is why it defines itself as being responsible, is that, for instance, we can talk about it later, but it means that you can use and reproduce Bloom, for instance, for everything you want, but if you want to apply, of course, you have to apply the license, then you have to stick with the use restrictions that are listed and prohibited there. So it means, like I gave you the example of medical advice, that's one concrete example, or it also states, for instance, that you can't use Bloom in military domains, etc., etc. So if we go back here, it means that the values that we expressed in the ethical charter were applied and included in this famous appendix of the responsible AI license. Okay. And then model card 2, for instance, if we talk about transparency, pretty easy, then it means that we're going to disclose everything, all the tech specs in the model card. So I already largely talk about reproducibility. So as I was saying, it has been described in the ethical charter, it has been expressed through an open license, and it has been operationalized by the technical documentation. And then, for instance, multilingualism was also a value for us, because we really wanted to show that it was possible to make like a multilingual language model. It has been considered as a value to lay the foundation of the project, and then it has been considered as a technical feature in order to make our tools truly multilingual. So you can see the kind of circle there, coming from values, how those values inform other notions of compliance. Another example, so I guess you're familiar with the famous AI Act, and so also, so I was saying also regulations, like for instance, this example of EU regulation is really informed by values as well, like human oversight or stuff like that. Those are what we consider values, and so this is how our values also inform regulations. And the last draft of the EU AI Act refers to model cards as sources of documentation. Don't remember the article, specific article, but you can look it up. And so there's a match between the information that is required by documentation, by regulation, sorry, and the information that is expected from the AI community. And so there's potential here for model cards to become regulatory compliance tools in the future. So this is kind of the second part. We talked about ethical charters, ML licensing, and then ethical charter, licensing, and then regulation, standardization, and technical documentation. So, if we want to sum up everything, what's important to remember here? So I hope it's clear, a little more clear, like what do we mean by ethics, why it's important to apply it, where do you apply it, and why. And so let's not forget about education, and once again, not just like scholar or university education, but users need to learn what are good, useful, and also harmless uses, and how they can do the best with one of your best tools. Guidelines are important, but your job is not finished when you finish drafting your framework, for instance. It's where it begins. Because if you don't apply, for instance, the values or the principle that you outlined, then it's just going to be a void document that doesn't make a service to anybody. And so this is an ethical basis for other documents, as we saw, like for instance, for the legal and technical compliance. Then policy, of course, it still holds an important part, because holding companies and developers accountable when deploying it, it's still important, and also the job doesn't end when you finish developing, but let's not forget about those humans and those users. Feedback is also, of course, central and key in this discourse, because continuous improvement from experience and adapting to emerging challenges is always super important, because once again, as we said, you can't anticipate all uses, you can't anticipate all feedback. And I didn't really have the time to talk about that, but I think it's important also to remember that there's a right to oppose. It means that it's not because we're building ML artifacts that all humans or all users need to use it. Like having the freedom to refuse to use ML system, it's still, I think, an ethical value that we need to remember. And this is specifically true because if you remember the very first slides, free will and freedom are really important points and critical questions in ethics. So let's not also forget about freedom there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this insightful and interesting presentation. So we have time for questions now. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. You mentioned in the beginning of the talk that ethics does not mean consensus. So I was curious why then you chose a consensus-based process as a useful tool for BigScience workshop for the ethical charter.
Thank you, thank you. When I was talking, I was like, I'm sure I'm going to be misunderstood. So thanks for the question because it helps clarifying. What I mean by consensus, it means that if you remember here, oops, if we have different points of view of what it means to be good or right, it means, what I meant is that among philosophers, there's no consensus of what's the best way, like what's the best normative ethics. There's no such thing because it's really always contextual. So there's no consensus on what's good. That's what I meant. But there can be consensus, especially like in what it's called discursive ethics. There can be consensus found when we have to deal with something specific. Like, let's say you and me, we want to sit up and write an ethical charter. At some point, we have to agree on what are the best principles or what are the best values to apply to our project. I hope that's clear.
Hi. So this is not a question, but it would be nice to get your perspective on this. Like you talked about diverse ethical frameworks all around the world, and then you are selling software as something universal. So I was wondering how you could integrate all of these frameworks into software when you're selling it to people. And also, as a point added to this, you also talked about multilinguality as a value. So I come from India, and we speak more than 46 languages alone in the country. And I think Bloom has 46 languages included in it.
Yes.
So how do you decide what languages to include and what not?
Yes, great questions. Thank you. So first one, that's a really good question. So this is why I don't think like universal ethical charter is going to do any service to anybody, because I insist, I always stress the fact that it's important to make your ethical framework contextual to what you're trying to develop and deploy. And so, like, I always make the example, but in 2021, UNESCO tried to draft the very first, and I guess the last, AI ethics charter. That was kind of a flop, because at least as I'm aware of, it's not really applied anywhere. It's because when you're trying to make these kind of really universal things that are supposed to apply to any context, like for instance, let's say you want to deploy something that is for, I don't know, elder people, and then you want to deploy a large language model for education or whatever it's going to be your use case, then it's really hard to make, like, if you want to make it so universal, then you're obliged to make it too general. And when something is too general, it means that it's really hard to apply. And so it's kind of a cascade of consequences there. And this is why, at least I argue that it's really important to make it contextual, because otherwise you could fall on what it's called, and it's not my phrasing, ethics shopping, which is like, okay, I'm going to do a checklist of what are the coolest values or principles that I could stick to my ethical framework. And then, but once again, in ethics, as I was saying, like one of my final notes, is that values, if they're not linked to actions, then you can't really call them values. And second question about multilinguality, yeah, I think Bloom has more than 46 languages, and the question of how we pick the languages always come, and maybe we could have been clearer there, but like, for instance, we don't have German, which is really, like, I think here people speak German, but we just, since in our data governance process, we wanted to make the people that were helping us, like, constitute and making the data set. We didn't want to, like, let's say, for instance, take a German data set and say, oh, none of us speak German, so we're just going to make German a language of roots. We really want to get involved and let the people that really were native speakers involved in the construction and building of the dataset. So we just made a call, say, do you want to help building routes? And just the people who answered, they were the languages that we picked.
So just shortly saying, we have only time for one question. The rest you can definitely ask during the break.
Hi, sorry. I thought it was a push-to-talk affair. It's not. Thank you very much for the talk. You talk about the ethics of the AI models relatively in abstract, but in the end, they're all built these days, a lot of them by companies. Can you really build an AI ethics without the company itself having at its core an ethical approach? Because you talk a lot about, ethics comes from what the people should do. So if a company itself doesn't have a fundamental approach to ethics, can that ever be reflected in its AI models? Or put the other way, how do you drive a company to adopt the same ethical approach when doing models rather than, say, putting out their product as quickly as possible?
Okay, I think I understand your question. Thank you. So one of the main arguments, at least in business ethics, it's reputation. So that kind of works a lot. No, it doesn't work. Okay, so people say no. So it's not coming from me. It comes from literature. But can you build like AI ethic processes without an ethical approach? The answer is no. If you don't care, and if you're just doing that for reputation, then it's not really going somewhere. But I also want to stress the fact that it doesn't really always have to come from companies. It also can come from the external entities. For instance, now there are lots of consulting companies that are kind of exploding and coming out from everywhere, and that could also have trying to help companies or, I don't know, labs or whatever wants to build new ML artifacts to trying to have this kind of ethical analysis, because I hope I made clear that ethics, it's a process. So it doesn't stop when you stop building, it's just the starting point. So if you do it with a couple of slides, then it's not going anywhere. But if it's a really long process that's gonna come from the very beginning until when, I don't know, the company ends, then it can be useful. But of course, it's hard not to fall in the ethics washing trap. As greenwashing exists, also ethics washing exists, of course. But it's hard not to have a really well-established ethical process. And please listen to humanities and social science people too, because there are a lot of people that say I'm an expert in ethics and I come from computer science. Thanks, I love it. But ethics has been existing for over 2,000 years. And what I see usually is that when engineers or people working in that sectors trying to they're encountered with ethical questions or ethical tensions, it's a pity because they tend to reinvent the wheel why those questions have been existing for a really long time. And so maybe it can be helpful to collaborate on that point. So if you want to integrate ethics in your company, please hire ethicists. I think we're done, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's thank our speaker again.